much for coming today.
That's fine.
My name is Bishar Damani. I'm a professor in the Department of History and Director of Middle East Studies, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Shahzad Bashir for the talk concerning the Ali Khan Chair in Islamic Humanities. We have a tradition here, as most of you know, we don't do introductions. You have in front of you a sheet that has all the relevant information about the talk, the bio, the title. But since this is being streamed and also recorded, and please tell your colleagues who are not here that they can still watch it. We'll be sending out the link tomorrow. I must at least say a couple things. One is we're really honored to have you here today. Thank you very much for coming. And Shahzad Bashir is Elizabeth Warren Anderson Professor in Islamic Studies at Stanford University. And his talk is titled A Mihrab and a Minaret, Reading Time in Islamic Materials. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishara, for the introduction and for the invitation and for all of you to be here today. It really is a great pleasure. Many moons ago, I actually lived in Providence for 2 years, so walking by the Louis Diner, for example, I remember many breakfast moments and all kinds of other pleasant as well as painful memories associated with graduate school. So it's really lovely to be here, and really it's a great pleasure. And I really look forward to your comments and questions in this talk, because this is very much work in progress and is associated with the major work that I'm doing at the moment while I'm on leave. So what I'm working on is the question of Islam and temporalities, and that's what I will try to lay out what I mean by that through a couple of examples here. So I was trying to think of how to explain where this project comes from, or what is kind of driving me towards this. And I think the best way I can explain this is that since the time I've been a graduate student in the study of Islam, I have found myself being confronted with a kind of disjunction. The disjunction has to do with, on the one hand, I grew up in a majority Muslim society, and then I can read and spend immense amounts of time reading various types of materials produced by and about Muslims. When I read these materials, and when I think of my own experience, what I find is that Islam is actually a set of arguments and rhetoric. And there is no stability that I at least can find there, that even when we have an explanation or an evocation of a belief or something like that, that is always being done against something else, etc. Right? So for me, Islam is something that is always actually being constructed in motion. Now, compared to this, Islamic studies, as it is practiced in the US, and certainly of the type of training that I received as a graduate student, the ultimate objective and the imperative was also always to define things, to explain what happened, basically a very positivist kind of approach to materials. I think one of the ways in which one can see this very much is in the writing of encyclopedia articles. I did write a few of them in the early part of my career, and then I found them to be unbelievably painful. And I really disliked the ones that I did write, and now I always decline and then refer to people who are fantastic at writing them. It's simply something that does not actually conform to the way I think, the way I approach materials, and this is part of this disjunction. So in all the projects that I've undertaken, it is trying to put this motion back into materials, particularly when we are talking about pre-modern materials, pre-modern societies. There is an even greater possibility of making things stationary or seeing things as being somehow fixed rather than in motion. So time is an important and interesting way to go through this, because it's change over time that is of course the mantra of the writing of history. But also because time itself is an absolute conundrum. So as a part of this work, what I first started doing was looking at all the debates about time that are going on at the moment in terms of philosophy, history, anthropology, etc. And basically there is no unanimity whatsoever anywhere. Time is a conundrum. It is so today as it was for Aristotle and Plato and Avicenna and all the different types of materials one can look at. And then we add not just the philosophies, but how is time actually lived, inhabited, then we see all kinds of other diversities as well. As far as I'm concerned, this diversity and lack of unity is actually exceedingly productive. So I focus on temporality, by which I mean basically the experience of time. I'm not really concerned with abstract theories about time, of which there are plenty, anywhere from physics to philosophy. I'm really interested simply in how do people operationalize time in a way? What happens with time? Where do we see time? How does it get materialized? How does it get changed, etc.? So I'm interested in time and human understandings through looking at experiences, narrations, material culture, etc. I basically go hunting for time wherever I can find it in all the materials that I've been looking at. And it has been great fun, actually, to try to. Now, this kind of an approach can work only with case studies, because I'm actually explicitly opposed to the notion of any kind of a grand narrative of this at all. So it can only work through case studies, and through the case studies, my ultimate aim is to bring alive certain human contexts that are connected to these case studies, and then to see them changing themselves in various ways. What I mean by that will become clear through the two examples that I will share with you today. One is a mihrab in the city of Isfahan in Iran, and the second is a minaret in Kudus, in the small city of Kudus in Indonesia. So what I will do is to actually present you these two monuments and then take through some of the things associated with them, and then eventually come back to conceptual issues implicating Islam and religion and history, which are the things that are interconnected in this project. So very briefly, I think majority of people here would know exactly what a mihrab is, but this is what you see on the screen is a generic mosque. A mosque is, as a building, has to be pointed towards the city of Mecca. There's immense complicated calculations that have to be done over the centuries and all kinds of debates about this. And mihrab is simply a blind niche on the wall that is pointed towards Mecca. Now, the mihrab is actually, if we think about it, is a very interesting concept, right? Because it is the thing that actually creates, that sanctifies the space on which it is constructed. It is through orientation, through creating this axis between where the mihrab is pointed and Mecca, that the place where it is being constructed gets sanctified. Right? So it's often talked about in terms of the fact of these mihrabs pointing towards Mecca. And the interesting thing there for me, from a historical perspective, is not Mecca, which is stable, but the fact that the unstable space goes into a stable sacral state through the construction of the mihrab. Partly because of these cosmological reasons, and partly simply because of reasons of architecture, etc., mihrabs have always been a focal point for ornamentation. So what you see on the screen here is one of the great, most elaborate mihrabs constructed anywhere at any time. It's the mosque of the Great Mosque of the mihrab of the Great Mosque of Cordoba in Spain. Now, from this, I want to. I'm going to discuss one of these mihrabs. Right. So here is a map of Iran, and here is the city of Isfahan in central Iran, one of the great cities in the Islamic world. I hope many of you visited. If not, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most charming places that one can go to. So inside the city of Isfahan is this mihrab. And this mihrab is located in a prayer hall in the Great Friday Mosque of Isfahan. I will talk a bit more about what this mosque is in a few minutes. But it is inside a fairly small chamber. So I like this picture because you can sort of see the scale by thinking of the human being who is standing in front of the mihrab. And it's a very, very ornate space where it is present. Here is another view, a closer up view. So you can sort of see that it is very elaborate in terms of its decoration, and then there is this blind niche, kind of a hollow, a concave hollow in the wall that is pointing towards Mecca. And just to show you how elaborate it is, here's a close-up of the top part of it, which contains a text. Now, this mihrab is generally thought to be one of the ultimate examples of stucco work in architecture associated with Islam. So it's a very, very celebrated monument in Islamic history and Islamic art history. Now, so as a monument, it's very significant. And then we have the fact that its shape has this kind of universal value because of pointing towards Mecca and creating, sacralizing this space. Now, this mihrab is also fascinating because it has 3 different texts that are actually inscribed on it. And what I did was, so I translated the 3 texts. All three of them are in Arabic. That's what is on your handouts. I'm not going to go through the details of these texts. There's all kinds of things going on here. And we can discuss if there's anything particular that catches your eye. But I will just summarize what is actually in these texts, and I will show you where they're placed, and then talk about how we can interpret them. Now, in the very middle, what you have here, which is marked as number 1, is a text that says that this mihrab was constructed on the orders of a king by the name of Sultan Muhammad, who is known better in historical sources by the longer name of Khutabandeh ol Jaitu, on the orders of the vizier by the name of Muhammad Sawi, and constructed by an artisan by the name of Adud ibn Ali al-Mastari, and then it gives the date. So it's a very specific kind of commemoration, epigraphy of when this was constructed according to who asked for it and who paid for it and who constructed it. Then there's a second text that runs in this particular way as it is appearing on the screen. And this is a hadith, which is to say it is a report from Muhammad, in which a companion who's named asks Muhammad about who is going to have authority after him in the community after Muhammad's death. And Muhammad responds with a series of 12 names. These 12 names are eventually who are regarded as the 12 leaders of the 12 Rishi sect of Islam. So it's a kind of prognostication. In the time of Muhammad, he's being asked who's going to be the leaders after you, and he basically gives the names of his 12 descendants connected to his brother-in-law and nephew Ali. So these are children of Muhammad's daughter Fatima and grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And so that's just what the hadith says. Now there's a third text then that is running further in the margins. And the first part of this text says that whoever builds a mosque on earth is building a house for themselves in heaven. If you construct a mosque in the world, God will build you a house in paradise. And so this is a hadith, a report from Muhammad. Then is a statement from Ali, where it says that there are 8 things associated with going to mosques. All of them are good. It basically gets you salvation. It creates good conduct in you and provides you guidance. And the details of all this are in the text that you have. Now, so we can ask the question, what exactly are these 3 texts doing there? What is their interrelationship, right? So we can see them as texts by themselves, but the fact that they've been put together on a single monument, there is some internal logic that is going on. And this is where bringing in the question of time is one of a kind of a scope for bringing these texts together and thinking about them. So what I would suggest is that in a way there are 3 intertwined modes of temporality that are being kind of projected in the monument through these texts. The first one could call synchronicity, where there's a king, there's a vizier, and there's a local artisan. So first of all, it is actually giving us the social structure of the empire at the time that this is actually constructed. Right? It's directly reflecting that in the way that 3 names are presented. The king himself, who is constructing this, who's ordering this, is actually a fascinating character. So he's mostly known by his name Ul Jaitu. He's the 8th Mongol king of Iran after the Mongol conquest in the 1250s. The Ilkhanid dynasty is born, who are descendants of Genghis Khan, who gradually actually become Muslim over the next century or so. And Ul Jaitu is the 8th one of these kings. He is born and baptized a Christian. His Christian name is Nicholas, after a pope, because his mother was Christian. Later in life, he converted to Buddhism. Finally, he converted to Sunni Islam, and then he converted to Shia Islam. This monument is coming from a time when he's actually converting to Shia Islam, hence the 12 imams that are there. Right? Now, Christianity, Buddhism, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, they're all part of his history, and they're known of him as a person. So in the monument itself, we have the absorption of this very complicated conversion history and the fact of what a Mongol ruler means as a Muslim ruler. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of complexities that we can get into here, but one of the things is that when we start looking at the narratives about conversion, there is no certainty as to when he converted, when he did not convert, did he actually convert back to Sunnism, etc. There is no certainty, but the most interesting thing about the whole narrative and the data is precisely that there is no certainty as to what his identity was. Right? So we have all this complex identity being concretized, literally, in the form of the statement that is appearing on this data. Right? So by thinking about this, we're already putting this the monument into motion in some way through this kind of history. Then we have the vizier, whose last name or kind of his nisba is Savi, coming from the city of Sawa in Iran. This city is particularly famous for its bureaucrats. There are bureaucrats in this city that can be found all the way in Iran, in India, in Central Asia, etc. Right? These folks have their own histories that we have copies of. We have a whole literature devoted just to viziers in Persian, and particularly focused on these kinds of this city like Sawa, right? So there is a second history that is flowing through this monument, and then we have the local person whose hands actually were used to create the monument, right? And we have the intertwining of those three in just this little statement at a synchronic level, which tells us how this monument actually comes to be. So that's one synchronicity. Now, but then we bring in the second text that is there, which puts us into diachronicity. Now, what is happening in the statement of Muhammad when he says that after me there will be a 12 lineage of people who have authority, it's a statement being made about sacred time. One of the ultimate differences between Sunnis and Shias has to do with the question of evaluation of time. How is early Islamic time to be understood? From a Sunni perspective, that is the great golden age, the age of the four great caliphs. And after that, all kinds of things happen, and then one is trying to get back to the golden age. From a Shia perspective, the early age, after the death of Muhammad, is a tragedy, right? And it's a tragedy that is going to be redeemed at the end of time when the Messiah comes. Both these things are actually directly reflected in the text that is here. Right? So by writing this, the king and the vizier and the person who's doing it, they're placing themselves into sacred history, valorized history not just a continuation of moments, but time that is completely pregnant with meaning, right? And a particular type of meaning because we have 12 Rashi history. And it also connected to the future because of the messianic expectation. Right? And one of the interesting things about this king who sponsored this, Muhammad Khudabande is the exact Persian translation of the name Abdullah, right? Muhammad Abdullah. That's the name of the Prophet himself, Muhammad the son of Abdullah. We have lots of indication of this king and other Mongol kings who did have messianic pretensions that are coming from their Buddhist, Christian, Muslim backgrounds of various types, right? And so the placement of this hadith, and interestingly, when he gives the name of the 12 people who will come after him, the 12th one in the statement from Muhammad is not named. Muhammad just says, he will have the same name as me. So there is a recreation of Muhammad. And then we have Muhammad Abdullah, Muhammad Khudabande. So there are all kinds of arguments being made about replication of time through the presence of certain types of sacred beings that is being implemented through the placement of this. Now, another thing that is associated is genealogy. Genealogy is extremely important for Mongols. The only way you can be a king in Mongol context is you have to be descended from Genghis Khan. One of the effects of this prominence of genealogy is that in the centuries after the Mongol conquest in Iran, the status of Sayyids, descendants of Muhammad, goes through the roof. And the state puts immense amounts of money into creating special houses and providing stipends for anyone who claims descent from Muhammad. Right? So we have a Mongol principle that actually drives Islamic society in this context. And there is explicit interaction, explicit discussion of how Genghis Khan is exactly like Muhammad in the historical narratives from this period. And they two get intermingled in various ways. Eventually, the Safavid claims that come later do the same thing. They actually kind of fructify it in a later stage. Okay, so here we have then diachronicity that is built into this. And then the third, we have atemporality, things that are not subject to time that is being presented. The odd thing about paradise, of course, when we think about it, and this is again reflected directly in the narratives, is that paradise is a space that has no time. Now, the ultimate problem or the kind of conundrum that comes up is, in paradise you're supposed to have eternal pleasure, in hell you're supposed to have eternal pain. But there is no time, there is no change. How can you have experience without duration, without change, right? And so paradise is a paradox, it's a temporal paradox from our spatio-temporal perspective. And it is, but its exceptionality is precisely that it is not like the time and space that we can rationalize in any way whatsoever. Right? And so there is this atemporality reflected that by coming into the mosque, by looking at this thing, by paying for this mosque, somehow you are actually escaping time. You are accessing atemporality in a way that is not possible in ordinary experience. And then the other things that are there have to do with ethics and salvation, which are again universal principles that are not subject to temporal contingencies, unlike the other things that are mentioned here. Now the ultimate thing is that these three modes of time are completely intertwined, they're interdependent, right? And they are being projected through different statements. But the fact that they're presented together on a single monument tells us something about the complexity of the world, the social world within which this is being enacted, the politics of it, the religious politics of it, the notions of sanctification that are involved here, of piety, of economics, all these things that are associated with a complex society that we do know exist, certainly here. They're all part of this, and they become understandable, or they become rationalizable when we bring in the lens of temporality to look at something like this. Okay, but that's only when we're looking at the thing itself. Then this thing is placed within this great mosque, the great mosque of Isfahan, which has been, since the 19th century, always been talked about as the repository of time itself. Now, this mosque has been under construction for 10 centuries. It has been expanded, it has been written over, all kinds of things. So I was trying to make a comparison. So it's a bit like a scrapbook made of palimpsests, because first you have construction upon construction upon construction, and then you have addition upon addition, right? When you go through this mosque, it is an incredible experience. You feel like you're going through a time machine. Everything changes, decoration changes from one room to the next, the floor goes up or down, the pillars become fat or thin, etc. It's one of the most unbelievable experiences that I've had in my life. One almost can feel like you're coming into contact physically with time. And this has been now discussed has been going on for nearly 1,000 years. The earliest mosque is in the 10th century. And this mihrab that we do, this is only a single little piece in there, which is in conversation with all kinds of texts. Just the collection of texts that can be found written on the walls of this monument go to 100 pages in Persian. And there are all kinds of things there, like personal confessions by kings that are there, etc., which I don't have time to go into, but I just want to put in that there is this other dimension that is there. Now when we go and look at this thing, there is no way to experience it except actually as a tourist site. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and one of the fascinating things for me has been that when I saw it, I mean, I was really just kind of physically moved, right? And I can trace 19th century art historians to whom this has happened. In the 800 years before that, when the mosque has been used, and it comes up in narratives all the time, no one ever mentions that this is a repository of time or anything. It's simply a place where you live. Right? So part of the thing about paying attention to time in this way, it kind of contextualizes that what I see is actually completely conditioned by my notions of time as well. Right? And so time is a way that allows us to, for me at least, that allows me to put into real conversation with completely other ways of thinking and being that are reflected in these materials. It doesn't negate or devalue what I might feel, but it provides another ocular view into these materials. Now, also, the monument has been reconstituted and reconstructed since the 1930s, all done mostly by Italian restorers. The ultimate book on the mosque has been written by an American art historian. Right? So, in effect, this repository of Islamic time actually has all this Buddhist and Christian background coming from when it was constructed and what was happening there, and then it is preserved by Europeans and to some degree Americans in text. And then I'm sitting here working on it, etc. And by working on it, I become part of the history of this monument as well. And it is by thinking through this that the notion of Islam as a kind of separable entity starts to break down when we see how temporally these monuments are actually continue to exist in various ways. I will come back to this point in a second. Okay, so now we're done with the mihrab and with Isfahan, and we go to completely a different place. And my work is constructed around many of these evocative examples, and I just chose two of them that are different enough that it will show you different views. So the second thing is a minaret. Minaret is, again, a typical feature of a mosque, and again, I feel like I'm sure you know this already, but it's the tower. Here is a generic mosque. It comes from a lighthouse. It has a long, complicated history, why it was constructed, which we are not going to go into, but it becomes a normal feature of a mosque fairly early in Islamic architecture. And it also is a major place for ornamentation. So here is one of the great minarets of Qutb Minar of Delhi in India. It's an important minaret. Now, I will show you a minaret that is on the island of Java in Indonesia, in this small city of Kudus in central Java. Now, this is what this minaret looks like. It's very famous. And so this is a kind of an outside view, and again, it's fairly tall, as you can see from the scale of the human being. Here's another view of it as well. And here is a kind of drawing where you can see what is inside. At the very top, it has this drum, beduk. In Indonesian mosques, people are called to prayer by beating the drum. And this is connected to a mosque where the drum is placed in the minaret, which is unusual because most times the drum is on the floor. It has a particular gateway, it has a clock on top, etc. as you can see. Now, the fascinating thing about this minaret is, what is it? At some level, yes, it's a minaret. Certainly it is used like a minaret. But from the 19th century onwards, there has been a discussion growing as to whether this is a Hindu monument or Hindu-Buddhist monument or is a Hindu-Buddhist Islamic monument. It has no writing on it. So there's no thing. Now, the question of Hindu-Buddhist Islamic comes up because of its form. Right? So at one level, the form is of a tower, like a minaret, but we have towers in all kinds of architecture, so that doesn't make it specifically Islamic. In terms of its actual decoration and construction, it follows exactly the pattern of Hindu-Buddhist monuments in Java and Bali that we can actually correlate this with. Right, so one point of fact is that until the 19th century, no one is discussing whether it's Hindu-Buddhist or Islamic. I mean, we just have no, it just is. It's connected to a mosque, which I will talk about in a second. In the 19th century, when external viewers, particularly Europeans and European scholars, start paying attention to it, they theorize it in different ways. So one possibility is presented is that it's actually, this was a Hindu-Buddhist temple. I won't go into the Hindu-Buddhist conjunction, but that's the way, there's two histories there already. But the culture and the religious culture of Java before the predominance of Islam is understood as Hindu-Buddhist because of intermixture. But anyway, so we regard the Hindu-Buddhist as one sense. But this was a temple, and then Islamization starts, so then it's incorporated into a mosque, and then it just becomes a minaret. So that's one possibility. Second possibility, which is that it's actually not, it's actually constructed for Islamic purposes, but it is telling us that this is an intermediate monument, because it is constructed at a time when the society is going from its Hindu-Buddhist background to Islamic. So they want to make a minaret, but they want to, of course, make it in a shape and that looks familiar to them about what a grand monument should look like. So hence, it's a Hindu-Buddhist thing that is somehow that has become Islamic, and the function is Islamic, but the form is Hindu-Buddhist, and so on. So we have three possibilities. One, the actual data is that no one cared until the 19th century. So this is telling us something about the construction of Hinduism and Islam in a particular modern mold, and that has to do, again, with history. These things are separable because of understandings of different types of histories that are associated with them. And then we have the two other possibilities, whether it's Hindu-Buddhist or Hindu imitation of Hindu-Buddhist, etc. For me, the most productive part of this is precisely that we don't know. That actually it's a conundrum, right? But it's what it is telling us, by looking at it this way, is actually that these things are not separable, right? And however we want to separate them tells something about the categories of time and space that we have in our minds that we are actually imposing on it, right? And so it's unlike the mihrab in the sense that it doesn't tell us what it is, and we have to speculate in various ways. Now, it is attached to a mosque that does have an inscription, very difficult to read, also in Arabic, and it has all kinds of complications. But on the handout at the very and the last thing is I did translate it to the degree possible for you. Now, what this inscription says is that this mosque was created by a non-religious person who has lots of titles and stuff by the name of Ja'far as-Sadiq. He built the Masjid al-Aqsa, which is what this is, in the town of Al-Quds in the year 1549 of the Common Era. This Quds is what is the Indonesian Kudus, which is still the name of this city. Okay, and so here you can see them together. So here is the minaret on your left, and then the mosque next to it, which is, as you can see here, it says in Arabic Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Now this is a modern mosque. Behind this is an old Javanese style mosque, which looks very different, but the one that is constructed in the front in the modern is actually directly referencing the mosque in Jerusalem. So what this is then, this is the construction of a new Jerusalem. It's the city as Al-Quds. You are creating a mosque of Masjid al-Aqsa. And so then the minaret is put into another completely different type of frame. Here is a Hindu-Buddhist looking monument that is actually recreating Jerusalem for Muslims in Indonesia. Right? And all of these things are being brought together into the material culture. Now, Islam's Jewish and Christian history is built into this already, right? And this is an important aspect of how Islamic history is understood. Judaism and Christianity and Jewish and Christian patriarchs and Jesus, etc., they are part, in all narrations of Islamic history, they're part of Islam, right? And that's, again, a valorized type of time. And that remains active. It doesn't end at the time after the time of Muhammad. These folks are creating a Jerusalem in Java, not a Mecca or Medina. There are plenty of Meccas and Medinas as well, but Jerusalem retains its specific value. And with it, Jerusalem comes Jewish and Christian history. Now, the other thing that this monument is famous for, the original one in Jerusalem, is from Muhammad's night journey into the sky, his Mi'raj. And so it is a place from which there is direct communication that happens with the heavens. And that's precisely the narrative associated with this mosque, where people will have these kinds of night journeys into the sky. And there's one particular figure associated, the one who was constructed, I'll talk a little bit about in a second, whose narratives about whom, his hagiographical narratives, are precisely about direct communication with the divine. He also goes to Mecca and all kinds of narratives here. He is a kind of new Muhammad who creates this Jerusalem and then has direct experiences. It's obviously connected with communal identity, the creation of an Islamic narrative tradition, an Islamic communal tradition in this part of Java. And if you look carefully at the text, you can sort of see this reflected in this, in the only text that we have. And it is a sacralization of time and space. The whole complex as such works like the mihrab, by orienting this part of the world to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem into Mecca and Medina. Okay, so this is just showing you a schematic diagram about how the different things are placed, with the tower and then the new Masjid al-Aqsa and the old one, and then behind them you can see this place called Complex Maqam Sunan Qudus. This is a shrine of this man, Jafar as-Sadiq, who actually is said to have constructed this monument. Now, right next to it, there is an entrance to the shrine itself, which has this plaque on top of it. Now, interestingly, it has two texts that are pointing to two different times. In Arabic, it says As-Sayyid Jafar as-Sadiq. Jafar as-Sadiq, by the way, is the name of the sixth Shi'i Imam. This is a Sunni monument in which the main character is the sixth Shi'i Imam. And in Arabic, it says that. In Indonesian, it says Sunan Qudus, which is the Indonesian name of the person. Right? The two scripts are actually bringing together two different temporal components within this monument. These are pictures of December, so that this is now. Inside what we have is the shrine itself, which looks exactly like the Kaaba. So you have Jerusalem and then you actually have a Kaaba, and the people are going around it in various ways. It has these drapes outside of it, it has these doors where people are going and praying for various kinds of things, much as the door at the Kaaba is used. There are specific rituals to be done there. And there's a tremendous amount of literature, popular literature associated with this man, Sunan Qudus, that is available. And this is a kind of very common presentation of it, what it's supposed to look like. Now, Sunan Qudus is one of the 9 saints who are called the Wali Songor. And these are people who in legend are supposed to have Islamized Java, starting in the 16th century. So the place itself, the fact that it is Sunan Qudus who is buried there, is one of the ur-shines of Java and its Islamic identity that is here. Now, I'm trying to suggest that this becomes possible through narratives and this specific space, which has this connection to Jerusalem and Mecca and Medina in various ways. Right? It's the creation of that world into this world to sanctify it. But most importantly, when we look at the narratives associated with Sunan Qudus, there is no sense, no indication whatsoever of any sense of inferiority with respect to people who live in Mecca or Medina or Jerusalem. They are the inheritors of Islam. What we see is actually he goes there and all the people there are atheists, and he actually teaches them what Islam is from the perspective of local narratives, right? So it's a complete transfer, a mimesis of Jerusalem and Mecca and Medina into this space. And this notion that somehow Indonesia is a periphery of Islamic world makes no sense whatsoever when we start paying attention to the narratives that are actually happening here. I think it kind of, for me, it's the question of time that allows me to kind of unpack this a little bit. Now, so we have the monument itself, then we have this long history associated with Sunan Qudus with it, and then we have a proliferation of contemporary uses of this minaret. It's on Indonesian currency. Here's a blogger community, here's a kid's book. You can buy little replicas of this there. All the aspects of modern commercialism and modern commercial culture, of reproducibility, of images, of objects, etc., they're all part of this. So at that level, it's a modern commercial icon as well, which is again deployed in this particular way, which brings into our time and the way the world in which we live works, which has its particular temporalities associated with objects and materiality in various ways. Okay, so where does this leave us finally? So final thoughts. As you can sort of see, what I try to show is really through examples about what some of the details of what happens when one takes this approach, and not so much a completely consolidated argument. So for me, if we use temporality as an analytical framework, it allows the possibility of thinking about Islamic correlations without reduction. What that means is that the fact that these two things are Islamic, and there are a gazillion others, they have interrelationships that construct various types of understandings and imaginations of Islam. We can understand them in their own right. We can understand them correlated to each other too. But that does not mean that we need to reduce the complexity and to try to look for a real Islam anywhere. These are all real. And we have to take them completely seriously as real, right? So I'm trying to avoid historiographic kind of dismissal of religious views in some ways, to take religious history seriously. But take it, so in a way to leave it where it is, to understand it in its own context, without trying to reduce it to some kind of a frame about Islam that I presume as a kind of universal. This is a major problem as far as I'm concerned with the way modern academic work on Islam has and I can talk more about this later if there is interest. So that's at the most basic level. Then we have the question of reading Islamic time spaces. Space and time are fundamentally connected. There's a tremendous amount of theoretical work on this, and I'm privileging time because I find it more analytically productive, but one could also possibly go with space. So when we look at Islamic time spaces, for me, what we find is continual construction and deconstruction without limits. There's no reason to think of Islam as a consolidated entity of any sort. What we actually need to look at, what makes most sense is to look at the implementation, the instantiation in different contexts, but that does not mean that we give up on the question of relations or relationality. Now, part of the reason I chose these examples is because I've used these adjectives as I've talked: Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Mongol, Javanese, Iranian, Indonesian, Italian, and American. And this is very deliberate, and it is trying to point out that Islam is not separable from these things. That these categories are actually, they're all implicated in this. Islam is co-constituted with these categories. We could take any one of these categories and one could do very similar types of things in which Islam has been implicated in the construction of these categories when we start thinking historically. Right? So we have to use the categories, and I'm not suggesting we can do it without these categories, but the categories should not be reified. This is not an instance of intermixing. It's intermixing only if we presume that they are separate. In actuality, these things exist, and it's our categories that that force us to create these kinds of conjunctions, right? So it's to try to, by taking this kind of a view, and by looking at time rather than presuming that any of these things is stable, it allows us to see the complexity of the construction of the categories themselves. The other thing for me that is very important is that in a historical trend, Islam is not an entity constructed by Muslims alone. One of the prevailing presumptions that one finds in the traditional academic discussion of Islamic history is that one looks to Muslims about what they said Islam is, and then we understand it from that. From the get-go, Islam has been an object of construction and imagination by non-Muslims. It continues to be today. It's not an accident that the US government tries to define Islam, right? It is a term that is powerful, that involves within it all kinds of relations, and it's constructed at the conjunctions of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, right? And so I'm trying to move away from a theologically perceived and theologically conceived history of Islam to thinking about it as an object of imagination that is constantly being constructed and deconstructed in the midst of human interactions that are not limited to Muslims alone. So that's one side of it. Now, the other part of this project and my larger work has very much to do with thinking about what do we do with pre-modern Islamic materials in modern humanistic setting. I'm very much conscious and interested in thinking about my own normative concerns and my own vision that drives me to see certain things, and all of us who work in modern contexts. And I don't want the observer to actually disappear from this observation. Right, so one of the benefits for me for thinking in these terms into temporality is that what we see when we look at materials is human beings inventing past, present, and futures, exactly the same way that we do it today. The questions that are being asked in contemporary philosophy of history that I can read, these are the same questions I find reflected in narratives concerned with written in the 12th century, 13th century. Of course, very different contexts, different languages, etc., etc., etc. But at the base level, in fundamental human questions, there actually is a tremendous amount of continuity. And it's not even just limited to narratives. We can actually think about narratives or part of social worlds in which human beings are asking similar type of questions. So one way the temporality is very productive for me is that it it kind of de-ghettoizes Islam and Muslims and Islamic materials out into a larger sphere of larger discussions in the humanities, where the questions are actually very, very similar. And for me, it also, the issue of temporality allows these perspectives to actually deconstruct me, as I've tried to show in the case of these two monuments. Right? It's to actually let these things speak while being acknowledging that what I am hearing being spoken has to do with my own prejudices and my own backgrounds. Right? Try to understand time is, and the notion of time is both that the thing that unites me with these materials and also divides me. And by thinking both unity and division, it allows for creation of narratives about the pre-modern past that are productive as a human endeavor at the largest level in some way. And ultimately, I think this is very important from my perspective because this is the only way, this type of approach, and there can be many others obviously, but I'm hoping that this contributes to getting beyond Orientalist frameworks for thinking about Islam that, to my understanding, still dominate very much in the discussion of pre-modern materials. At least that has been my frustration since I have been in this field. And the way out, as far as I'm concerned, is to think in categories that are actually transferable, where we get rid of Islamic exceptionality, and of course pay very careful attention to materials as they exist, but then own up to the categories that we are actually using and show what our investments are. And on that basis, try to construct humanistic discourses that do not create centers and peripheries, but ask questions that illuminate all kinds of issues within a humanistic discourse. There's in the tremendous amount of kind of chest beating about the death of the humanities that is going on, that one hears about all the time. One of the things that I find unfortunate, or at least for me, in the places that I work, is that all the discussion of the humanities is about Europeans still. In the meantime, we have a tremendous amount of data and scholarship that has already happened about Muslims and East Asia, etc., but that's never brought into the reconstruction of the humanities. But the only way that can be done is through concentrating on categories that actually bring the materials together, to write and to think in ways that actually speak to the Europeans, and to force them to bring into conversation through the fundamental constructed nature of categories, the different types of materials and worlds that we work on when we work on our individual materials. Okay, I will stop with that. Time is okay, I think.
No, this is great. Let's see if we can get some lights on so we can see each other. Whoa.
That's a lot of light.
Thank you very much. You can field your own questions. All I would ask is people introduce themselves when they ask the question. We're small enough, I think we can do that.
Okay. I'm Steve Bush. I teach interreligious studies, and thank you very much for your presentation. So I had a question about your first case study, and so I'm wondering why you characterize the ethics and the guidance as atemporal, because the sorts of things being described seemed like things that were very much playing out in time over the course of a lifetime, multiple visits to the mosque. Whereas had the purpose of text 3 to convey atemporality, there would be ways to speak about ethics in more atemporal ways, the eternality of the attributes of Allah, for example, or the commands of Allah. But instead, there are things like a firm sign, a word that saves from rejection, a word that points towards right guidance, leaving a sin through fear and shame, which seem actually to be rooting ethics very much in time and over the course of a lifetime. And then similarly, in text 1 and text 2, in text 1 I could detect duration, the length of rule of the Sultan, and in text 2 I could detect synchronic relationships. So when we look at the details, does it break down to try to position each one of these three texts in a different mode of time?
Yes, thank you. Actually, this is why on the top it says intertwined nodes. I was trying to simply highlight some of the things that is distinctive, that is happening in that material as compared to the other material. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one could dissect it in very many different ways. Essentially, my thought is that actually all three aspects are flowing through all these three statements. Right? And I'm just trying to highlight what seems to me to be the at the forefront. Now, with respect to ethics and salvation, yes, it's atemporal in the sense of that the things that are being valued are universally true, versus things that are being valued with respect to the genealogy, for example. It's diachronically related, right? So that's the only reason I was putting it there. So if I were to actually when I write it, I would make a much larger case about the intertwinedness of the three that is going on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shazad. I'm Nancy. I teach in religious studies. I have two questions. One is about the word productive. When you're talking about the either conundra or ambiguities, is it a minaret, is it a temple? To say that I understand why those questions are interesting and how ambiguity is maybe a little unsettling of assumptions, but I wonder if you could elaborate in maybe more precise terms, what precisely you think it is productive of, other than a view different from what is commonly held by most people when they think about the center of the Islamic world. Or if that's productive enough. But I suspect that for you there's something larger that I want to hear more about. But another question I had to do with your sort of characterization of adjectives, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, etc. And I'm wondering you articulated the historiographic stakes for wanting to change how people study Islam and Islamic materials. Are there similar maybe social or discursive or political stakes in talking about Islam this way? Because I think similar things can be said about other religious traditions. So clearly this is not uniquely Islamic, that it is a historical phenomena that is produced by multiple traditions converging differently in different places. But I suspect that there's a different kind of investment in your wanting to shape the conversation this way. So I wondered if you could flesh that out a little bit.
Sure. So on the question of productivity, I guess what is implicit in all of this is, for me, productive is that which makes me extract more out of the material than what simply appears on the surface, right? So and for me the ultimate thing is to try to understand what is the social world that is giving birth to this, in which this is being consumed, which is being utilized over the course of time, etc. What is the human experience that is actually embedded in this material? And what is the continuity of human experience that can be associated with it, and how ultimately it might reflect on what does it mean to be human for me, right? So it's at that level of kind of a very basic sense of what does it mean to be a historian, why bother, is productive in that kind of capacity for me. So productivity then has to do with the kind of mechanisms of unpacking that are made available by bringing these types of categories into the material. Okay, so I can give a lot of examples, and in the sense of my part of the reason I use it is that what I find when I read with others who have worked on these things, it's just simply descriptive.
Descriptive, right.
And so it's trying to get away from that. What's at stake? On the second one, what is politically at stake, for me, is to create a space for the study of Islam that is not according to the frameworks that exist and that I was taught in, but also that is not religiously identified or expressed in Islamically exclusivist terms.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So the notion of casting, say, Islamic history in terms other than law, the history of Sharia, the sort of the domination of our field by a kind of a Sunni perspective on legal texts, right? This is a conversation that's been happening for a long time. Is Islam primarily litigious? Is it not? We've just had this 600-page infusion of what is Islam, discussing this whole idea and saying Islam is everything from alcohol to sex to music to Sufism, etc., and trying to also decenter in a different way, a conceptual way. So, and I find that incredibly appealing, right? I would love to have a kind of a general understanding of the Islamic world that is not dominated by Saudi Arabia too, or by Brill's books on the Sunni tradition of law too. I would love to have that. So I understand. So is that the project that you're embarking on?
So I would say that my project is kind of going on a tangent from that. I'm opposed to the notion of. So I want to consider discussion of Islamic without Islam. Right. So for me, the notion of any construction of Islam is already becoming normative. It's quasi-theological. What I'm thinking is, okay, so I look at all this stuff. There are Islam and subcategories of Islam are being invoked all the time. Right? I want to be able to interpret the local worlds and to see the correlations, but without presuming that this adds up to a single thing called Islam.
So would you consider studying something that is not considered Islamic and try and incorporate it into the study of Islam? How is it? How does it?
We're going to need to leave room also.
Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry.
It's nominally.
Yeah.
Right. So that's my ultimate investment. If it is reflecting, it doesn't have to be simply linguistically, but it is invoking, referencing in a kind of semiotic way. Then it is part of this.
Okay, thank you.
Mark Cladis, Religious Studies. First, I want to say at the end of a very long day, your presentation is like a cup of strong coffee. It's just been stimulating. So thank you so much. Okay, I have 3 quick questions. I can say them very quickly. So the Indonesian case, you made a pretty strong claim that, so they're not feeling peripheral. They're feeling right the heart of the things, right? They have Jerusalem right there. Right. So I'm just wondering, first of all, if there was other evidence that they're actually feeling confident, because that could be actually a sign of they're kind of worried about their status, so they're appropriating. The other question, it has to do with, and maybe this is implied, but you use the term pre-modern and modern, and yet your whole talk seems to deconstruct those. But maybe that was all implied, so that's the second question. And then the third one, and you can pass on this if this isn't a quick question, but I certainly agree about identities are constructed at many intersections. But I kind of have to ask the normative question, that given that there's these constructions of Islam, for example, in the United States, as Islam as being the religion of terrorism, if there's some kind of normative pushback against that. I understand as religious studies scholars, we can just kind of describe that as part of the dynamic process of the way religions have been understood and described, but there must also be some kind of normative pushback against that.
Okay, so the first question was the issue of how much evidence is there, right? So that's when we look at the narratives. So we have preserved narratives connected to this place, starting in the 18th century onwards, and most of them are hagiographic. Now, in the hagiographical narratives, the hero is always the local person who's going there, right? So one of the narratives is that the first time that the minaret actually appears in a narrative is that he was in Jerusalem. He brought a stone, which he buried there, and then they constructed the thing on top, right? And the reason is because those places are corrupted, and the world required a new Jerusalem who was here. And there are all these other narratives in which he worsts the local scholars who come begging to him. There's no rain happening, and they have to come to him and then ask to produce rain, etc. Now, but there is a larger issue here, which I've tried to discuss in other places. So one of the major ways in which Islamic history has been constructed in the modern context is by beginning with Muhammad, and then we have dispersion model in various places, right? In this case, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis based on the early period. And that has been discussed extremely well and lots, well, maybe not well, but certainly a lot. And then, particularly for the middle period, from 1200 to 1800, you have this huge gap until fairly recently, right? So there is a kind of emphasis on origins as somehow defining something, etc. Right? Now, when we start looking at narratives that are actually produced in Arabic or Persian or Urdu until the 18th century, the early period is the least interesting one. The most interesting period, the here and now. That's where the longest description is, right? So there is a way in which the narrative is oriented, where the weight of the narrative is always in the original materials as to be on the place where this is actually happening, and not on what happened in Mecca or Medina. Those are just precursors, right? So there is a way in which modern history has actually inverted both time and space. But that starts to change when we start paying attention to these types of narratives. The pre-modern, modern thing, you're absolutely right, and that's implied, and part of the hope is very much, and this is why in the book that I'm writing, it's deliberately interspersing modern and pre-modern examples all over the place to try to break this down. But there is a problem of what does one call them, right? So usually it can just go by centuries of common era and things like this. And the third one with normative, so one of my, part of the, I will say my normative kind of insertion of myself in the debate about, say, ISIS or something like this, is actually to try to find a third space. It does not make sense for me historically to say that ISIS is not Islamic or certain types of things are not Islamic. But that is, so how to do that without being co-opted by the critique of that, right? So I'm trying to say that actually history and time are one of the places where one can at least provide some kind of an arena to rethink the questions we ask of this material. I find the quote-unquote defense of Islam perspective to be equally flawed, and quite frankly, to an American audience that is anti-Muslim, if you go and say Islam is good, it's a nonsensical statement. I mean, I've been to, children's school, for example. My son was in school, so they were doing a section on Islam. The teacher found out I work on this, she wants me to come. I look at the catalog and the textbook. The California textbook says, Islam is always good, etc. So I'm standing there. These 10 years old can say, well, what about 9/11? Is it right? So I think at the level of that kind of a normative defense, it simply does not work for me. History has normative things built into it, and I want to try to identify my own and bring them out as a kind of a third or fourth or fifth space.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
My name is Michael Sattler from Religious Studies. So I just to kind of build on that for a second and move on to my real question. In the study of Judaism, which is what I engage in, right, the shorthand for this kind of problem comes out to be Judaism's, right? So I'm just wondering whether kind of Islam's works for you on any level, or why you might or might not take that. My real question is really, this was fascinating. So normally, in the historiography I'm used to, you have a real tension between sacred space and sacred time. And that goes back to certain kind of theological presuppositions. Is there more deity in a place, or is deity everywhere? And therefore, it's out of place, and place is almost a fetishization. So you're using this word time-space, and I think that's fascinating. And as a way of kind of breaking down that binary, but I'm struggling with it. It's kind of because maybe I'm just so used to this binary. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and this really gets to this point of using your material to make a larger point within the study of religion, or whether you think that binary is not a good binary, and that we should be thinking more in terms of, some kind of time-space continuum rather than.
Yeah. So I think that see, as a theological differentiation, that binary makes perfect sense, because it's a binary that's actually invoked in the original materials, right? But what I find is that when one approaches material historically, that the binary always breaks down, because from a historical perspective, of course, any kind of sacred has to be materialized in time and space, right? The idea of for me to be able to study something that is sacred, it requires a text, a monument, or something like that. So it already has been materialized, right? So if one is looking at a text, if one makes a differentiation between the materialized text itself and what the text is actually saying about the problematization of the difference between time and space, those are two different things. And as a historian, I don't want to ever forget that the text is actually materialized. Right? This is very much a kind of parallel problem with respect to the body. So many things that I've worked on, there is a differentiation between the soul and the body, and particularly in Sufism, there is a kind of negative aspect of the body has to be overcome, etc., etc. Right? So, but when I start looking at what exactly are these people doing with their bodies and what they're saying about the body, there is no access to the soul except via the body. Right? As Carolyn Walker Bynum has this fundamental, really wonderful way of saying it when she says that in order to get to the soul, you have to dig through the body, right? So in that way, historically, then it is always intertwined. Theologically, I can certainly see if one is just trying to understand theologically and philosophical systems, then that binary has a purchase, and which is absolutely fine. And partly is why I've very much the question of what this looks like historically becomes significant.
Which I'm asking analytically rather than, because analytically then, does the binary make sense? Or you're really saying it doesn't, I think.
Historically, I think it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense if one is working from within, trying to understand the system, right? And your first question, I'm trying
Islam's.
Right. See, for me, the problem with the Islam's part is that then it presumes that their Islam is actually substantiable, right? And so that you can have multiple ways of substantiating Islam. What I want to say is Islam is actually this amorphous, imaginary entity that is constantly in flux without any boundaries or bounds, right? And so it's so for me to keep it as a single, but to deconstruct what actually it is as an entity works better.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. I agree with the strong coffee description. So I'm thinking of the Talal Asad's intervention in discursive tradition and his appropriation of MacIntyre and all that. So when you say no boundaries or bounds, is that even, if we take the bare minimum, or to say that in order to have an argument we have to have some kind of basis or same language, and that is an admission that the Quran is the word of God or that the Prophet is the last prophet as the bare minimum so that we can enter into an argument about what actually that means and how to substantiate it and how to live it?
So
or are you moving away from that?
No, I would like to move away from this because I think that it's very much the question as to that fact of the Quran and Muhammad cannot be abstracted out and separated out from the living context in which it's actually invoked.
Right. Well, he says that. So that's what the argument is about then. Then how do we actually live it? But you have to at least have that same premise. Otherwise, what do you have in common? Or what language are you arguing in?
Because you can have Islams in which these things are actually not. I mean, you can have Islamic communities in which they have no interest in Muhammad and the Quran, but they will identify it as Islamic. I mean, if you look at the history of conversion in India, for example.
But I thought we're not just following what Muslims say and do.
Right, but I mean, how? So you can always also have things in which the people who are being called Islamic or Muslim don't agree to that, right? So Islam I want to completely diffuse it out and not to put any kind of. So discursive for me, imprisoned is a bit too much. I mean, I don't. So like I'm almost suggesting, well, why bother? Why? So to understand any of these monuments, one can look at what is going on here and now in the moment, right, and then put it into a different context. Why do we have to presume that there has to be a discursive? Because if one presumes it, that there is some kind of a minimal discursive unity, it actually exerts pressure on the interpretation. Right?
But who are these blank slate humans who are constantly reinventing Islam? They all have a knowledge picture. They all have an experience picture out of which they relate to this concept, whether they call it that concept or not. So that, you are attempting, it seems to me, to dispense with the starting place, okay. But these humans who are reinventing are blank. What are they reinventing from? I think the second Shreen's question.
This Palmer Robert from
Sorry.
Such a good conversation. We just
From the history
Which is
department
great,
and our
exciting.
studies.
So they're inventing from certain places, but those places, yes, they're inventing, and we have to understand. This is why, looking at the mihrab, it is very important to understand what the historical lineages are that are coming into the text. And the reason this comes about is precisely because of this thing. My difficulty is not with saying that somehow people are blank slates, but that from that we do not need to presume an abstract Islam that somehow can be used as a criterion for some other invention of Islam.
But we are presuming something against which we are measuring their violation of the boundaries.
No, we're not, right? Because it's just what they're saying is what we're looking at.
Fine. But they're saying something out of a context, of some of these texts you're talking about, or some of the experiences of denying Islam. So when Evliya goes to Albania, he says, these people are black infidels, but if you call them black infidels, they'll kill you. That's, a set of dialogues or texts about who people think they are and whether it's Islamic or not. But I guess the issue I have is what is, for any of these individuals, any of these communities, any of these builders of materiality, there is some knowledge picture of religion against which they are conceptualizing themselves, or with your model, against which we're conceptualizing ourselves.
Right, but so if we look at the two monuments that I showed, would you say that there is a single knowledge picture, or are they completely different?
No, of course not. But I think the notion of the deconstruction of the monolithic nature of Islam has been going on, for many generations of scholarship. So,
but eventually it then gets tied still to there must be something called Islam to which they're all referring, right? So, I mean, one way of, if I understand your question correctly, right? So you're saying that we look at these materials, and of course these people are imagining themselves as Muslim in a certain tradition with certain residues and narratives, etc. Right? But as historians, we do not need to adopt that perspective.
no.
So then, what is the relationship between our work and these perspectives?
Well, I thought you were suggesting that in many ways it was completely individually subjective.
No, not at all. I mean, this is why I went into showing that the three different types of, there is universality here, there is diachronicity, there is synchronicity, there are all kinds of things that are actually built. Time itself is precisely the thing that disallows any kind of supposedly autonomous individual. We are bound by time, and this is why bringing in my own reaction to the mosque and saying that this reaction is impossible or is not in evidence until the 19th century, is that I am also bound very much by the structures, whether I know them or not. Right? So I want to construct narratives that constantly interplay with this, rather than an abstractable Islam.
Does it help to call yourself a non-essentialist with respect to Islam? I mean, does that help the conversation? You don't have an essentialist view of Islam.
Yeah, and true, but I think, so that's the conversation that has been happening for a long time. So, but the issue is that despite all this deconstruction, every textbook that you pick up today still says the same thing, right? What is it how is it possible?
So, I mean, I love this free flow, but there's people with their hands up, so if they can get a chance to ask.
I was watching, I saw Sheila Vazira, and if I may, just to make sure, get more voices.
Thanks, I'm Sheila Bond, History of Art and Architecture, and perhaps not surprisingly, I want to ask about the buildings. Thank you very much for temporalizing them. I have another model for time that I want to ask you about, and that comes from a reading of the minaret, which is in many ways a timepiece. It calls people periodically to come to a building and to face the mihrab over and over again. And I'm wondering, in your reading of time and in people's experience of these buildings across time, do you see some tension between linear time, whether that time is historical or a constructed present or future, and a cyclical time, which has them experiencing together a ritual, a sacral space, over and over again, sometimes in communion with people from the past. This is a model I've found productive in my own work on Christian monasticism, and I'm wondering if in these built experiences there, this is also productive.
Yeah, actually, so the kind of the way I thought about that question is that, to my sense, the linear and circular time are actually co-constitutive. There is no such thing as a purely linear time. There's no such thing as a purely circular time, right? And you can almost see this already even in this one monument, in the sense of that there is a linear time of genealogy, and then the 12th Imam is actually the same thing as Muhammad and Jafar Sadiq, etc. So there is this constant linearity and circularity that is going on. So what I found most productive or useful is to always, if I see circular time, to then see the linearity in it, right? So there is the circular time of the day, but then there is a linear time of the progression of the day, which is being involved there as well. I'm trying to think of, another place where, at least in my mind, this is very much there, is even the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. They're very much constructed temporally, right? So the day, the month, the year, the lifetime. But they're also then circular as well. And then in Sufi exercises, etc., they're very much concerned with this. So one of the interesting things is that one of the words that is used for Sufis from the very beginning, earlier texts, is Ibn al-Waqt, the son of the moment. The Sufi is the one who can actually pierce time. And so that piercing is, or coming to dwell in that moment, is trying to actually still both the linearity through a kind of reduction of the circular to the point, as the way they talk about it. And then there's enactment of that in religious exercises in various ways, and there's a question of reduction of time through the reduction of experience, and the deadening of the senses becomes significant.
Thank you. That's been a very interesting, very provocative presentation and way of thinking about material culture and historical archive. And as someone not familiar with thinking through religious texts and ways in which one might work with material culture as an archive, I was particularly curious to follow up on the pre-modern, modern question, which is in a way, material culture allows for what it seems to me what you're doing, which is suture the rupture of modernity that so many of us who work in the modern period try to think through, right? So in a way, you're suturing that rupture, and what I would like you to explore further with us is a little bit the political stakes in suturing what is, for some of us, regarded as a rupture that needs pronunciation.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I would say is that so from my perspective on the pre-modern, is that the pre-modern is a modern construct from the get-go, right? So there is no escape from that fact, and even the construction of the notion of the rupture is a modern construct, right? Now, but to say that does not mean then to say that there's nothing to be said about quote-unquote otherness of the pre-modern. Okay? So what I'm interested in is destabilizing that notion of rupture, which is coming from a particular type of European historiography, of the production of notions of ages, in which modernity is the latest, right? And by looking at these materials, to not do away with the notion of change over time and even radical change, but to try to destabilize the exceptionality of the modern moment. I'm not sure if this is making any sense. So I'll tell you. So
I'm thinking capitalism, I'm thinking industrial time, but that's just because I'm much more embedded in social history than religious.
So I see. So I think that when we are talking about, at least for me, about capitalism and industrialization, etc. So these are aspects of radical change that can happen over a certain time period. And then what, at least for me, what ends up happening is that these material transformations get mapped onto perceptions or kind of claims about radical change in thought, etc. I mean, in a lot of studies. Now, when one starts to look at these material and with the background of reading pre-modern, they often don't seem that terribly exceptional, right? So for me, the exceptionality of modernity is a kind of an ideological position coming from a certain version of European history, which is precisely what has produced the notion of universal progress and so on and so forth, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to do is to, I mean, I don't want to take this on as a project on itself, it's not my field, but by at least thinking in the context of Muslim materials, by putting the transformations of modernity in conversation with other tremendously transformative moments. So I'll show you this. So this is the table of contents of the book. And so one of the chapters is on transformational moments, in which what I'm trying to do is to put the conversation about time that is happening in the 9th century, when Islam becomes a discursive object in its own sphere in the material that we have, together with what happens in the post-Mongol materials, and there's a vogue in writing of history right after the Mongols come, in which the question of time is very much there. And then you have in the 19th century tremendous amount of discussion going about that is happening in Arabic and Persian, in Urdu, etc., about what's happening to us, right? So I want to put these into conversation with each other. So there are certainly tremendous differences, and etc., right? But it's the exceptionality of it that I want to kind of try to work with a bit more.
Hi, I'm Yola Dolatai from Anthropology. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas. I wanted to ask, okay, so you've spoken about reading time. And I'm wondering if you've thought, and now when I'm seeing the experience of time in some of the different chapters you've laid out, if you've thought about how Muslims in contemporary Iran, Indonesia, or elsewhere measure time and keep time. So in the political stakes around prayer times, around when they choose, which date to have, Eid celebrations or not, because there's tremendous uniformity and quite a lot of ambiguity around the way they measure and keep time, and along with the body, right? So I'm wondering if you have things to offer.
So that's not an area that I have thought through directly. But what you're saying makes very good sense, and this is ultimately what so this is going to be I'm hoping, fairly short book. And so I cannot, I'm not actually claiming to encompass all of it. It is what I've essentially kind of thought about, the way I thought about it is that these are strategic, very episodic kind of interventions of a certain type, whether it's just hopefully will be productive for people to criticize them and then change them or find them useful or not. But you're right, I mean, so there we already have a very interesting aspect of the of correlation with time. So one of the fascinating things about Islamic literary materials throughout the ages is the question of dating. Right? Actually, the where this project really got started was when I was looking at Timurid materials from the 14th, 15th century. And one of the most curious things is in the same narrative, different events are actually denoted according to different calendars. So it will say this happened and the date is given Hijri. The next event happened, that date is given as the Chinese zodiac calendar. The next one is Mongol calendar. The next one is a regular calendar of the ruler, right? And it's in the same text, right? So it becomes like, well, how are these people actually managing? I mean, if we had a narrative like this in which all of the dates being used without some kind of a presumed standard calendar, it would be very, very confusing. And what that led to, for me to think through, and I found this very much the case, that these societies in which these things are being based on, they have multiple time narrations that are working constantly through the material, and they are actually conscious of it. This is actually explicitly discussed. Right? So that's another way in which it is working, which I thought through more. But thank you for that comment. Actually, I that.
No, it was an unfair question because as an anthropologist, I was thinking about how, you know,
The kind of live.
navigate through that. Yeah, so it's admittedly unfair.
Both have our hands up, but
Well, so does Michelle.
who's gonna blink?
Well,
I don't blink. so
let's
you
go
guys
to
can
people who
decide.
haven't asked yet, so Faze, and then maybe I'll get a chance.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Shazad. I think, needless to say, really provocative talk and really making even the most familiar things really complicated and ambiguous. And I have kind of a common question, two things. The first is that picture of the Sunan Jafar Sadiq, or in Indonesia. I'm wondering if that is about members of the Ba'alawi Sufi Tariqa or order that is coming from Yemen, and they're Sunnis, but they're descendants of Ahlul Bayt, of Imam Hassan. And so the reveration of Fatima and the Ahlul Bayt is actually, I'm mentioning this because one of the things I thought that's undervalued, and maybe you can mention, I mean, you could be even more confident about because I found it fascinating, was this: you're not just destabilizing Muslim, Christian, Mongolian, Iranian, but internal, i.e. Sunni Shia, which, I mean, at a time when, I'm just thinking of a map quiz in my class today, students don't know where Iraq is, but they know there's Sunnis and Shias there, right? They don't know where Iraq, but they know it's so ingrained. And so you're destabilizing within the category of Islam. I thought that was, the other thing is that I'm thinking Ottoman architecture, even the dome, such a basic concept that we just affiliate with Islamic architecture. Is that not coming from Byzantine Greek domes? Because we don't find domes in the early period. So can you also extend that? So this is about the suggestion comment. The real question I'm thinking is, so Islam itself, you're destabilizing the category, of course, which is has a lot of purchase politically and intellectually. But I'm wondering, is that not already present within the concept itself of Islam, such that Islam is one religion that has privileged the Arabic language, for example, and the Prophet Muhammad as a final prophet. But there are these, within the theology, there's recognition of these previous prophets, specifically the prophets of ancient Israel, who obviously didn't speak Arabic, didn't call themselves Muslims, and spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, etc. So, but yet they are called Muslims in the Quran. And so do you see what I'm getting at? Is that isn't there a recognition that the term itself that's so prized, Islam, Muslim, is historicized, is temporal, but also connected to something atemporal? I was just wondering how you deal with that and engage that. I hope the question makes sense.
Yes, I mean, this is partly what I was suggesting with the Quds example, that the prehistory, the Jewish Christian prehistory, is very much part of it. But it is the one particular version, right? So these prophets, as understood in Islamic context, are not recognizable to Christians and Jews. I mean, certainly in the case of Jesus, right? It doesn't work. So it's not that they are Islamized in some ways by incorporated in the particular types of Islamic history that one does. Right. So I'm very much interested in that in terms of seeing how the boundaries work or don't work. And with the Sunni Shi'i case, yes, very much so. I mean, one of my arguments, and I'm finishing an article on this, is that what we call Islamic history is actually Sunni history. If you told this history from the perspective of Shiism, it would look completely different. And the problem is under the pretension that somehow the Shi'i history is mythical versus the Sunni is not.
Alternative.
Right. So it's very much part of this thing, and one of the chapters goes into this details of this as well.
I know it's 6 o'clock, so if you have to leave, please feel free, but I'd still like to ask a question. That's okay.
We're out of time, but we have time.
So, I really, I'm fascinated by this talk. Let me just wait for a minute.
I'm so sorry to have to leave.
I think the strong cup of coffee business is really a good place.
It even looks like the minaret.
You have to ask your question because we're in a rush now.
Yeah. So my question really has to do with this interface between the subjectivity of the scholar and the materiality of the material. And it kind of requires and I think I'm persuaded that you actually have the capacity for this in abundance, kind of a constant vigilance. There's a constant vigilance that is required. On the one hand, there needs to be an atomization of the subject of whatever you're looking at, but on the other hand, it needs to be repurposed, re-put together. In this case, the lens of temporality is really, I think, an excellent way to escape some of the station stops that we had in development in the field of Islamic studies, where we really, I think, need an exit from some of the issues that we discussed today, but in ways that doesn't determine what then the next station stop is going to be. And if I want to think of somebody who can sit there and just sort of work with us about this, I mean, I think today is a good example of that, how that can happen. My question is, you started with the idea of different temporalities coexisting. And this is something that's been taken up by historians of the modern period a lot. The question of colonial time or registers of time versus et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see in the study of like Persley's forthcoming book about Iraq, youth in Iraq in the 30s and the 40s, they worked within different concepts of time all the time. So in that sense, does it make, is there a way that a sweeping argument can be made about different understandings of time that have different durations of practice, and in that sense can become common reference points that could, in a way, destabilize, like you want to do with the whole question of rupture or the whole question of what you call the discursive unity, the weight of discursive unity, but at the same time can come up with a different sort of model that can be taken apart, no problem, but at least a model of how different notions of time survived and reproduced themselves in ways that we can give more of a unity to the subject of what is Islam.
Yeah, so I think that in some ways this is partly implied in what I'm doing, in the sense of that, like for example, 12 Rashid time is clearly present here, and that has a long history of its own, right? And so that's implicated here. And then that is being contrasted with Mongol time within the monument, etc. So
right, exactly.
So yeah, I think that where I'm not entirely sure, so at the level of saying that the multiple temporalities coexist in the same moment, intersecting, so that's fine. But whether there could be a standardized set that could be then called the purview of Islam.
Well, like the Hajj, for example, the whole idea of the Hajj, or whatever. I mean, you can choose that there's something that is commonly a reference point of that could be thought of in 5 different ways at the same time, but you can see through literature that actually certain ways outlast others and can have a deeper groove in the way that people practice, right? Is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as a kind of a question of thinking through the explanation of a given context, yes, that would be very valuable. What I would resist a little bit is a kind of a meta-theorization on that. Because then, again, it begins to then approximate the standardization a bit.
Right.
And I don't see why we have to do it.
So, can I ask one question about this? I think, and my question is basically, what am I missing about your argument? Because I agree with everything I've heard, and I'm asking these questions because I'm really fascinated by it and I want to understand it. And I suspect there's something subtle that I have not yet comprehended. Because, I agree completely that our current understanding of how to study Islam has been dominated both by the Sunni hegemony and by this kind of linear sense of time that fetishizes origins. Yes. As a person who studies origins, I've tried very hard not to do that, and have done some investigations of sort of later medieval iterations of the early historical stuff as ways of re-envisioning the present, right, the 14th century or 12th or 13th century present, right, and have argued that historical legitimation is bidirectional and less about, they were over the origins. They knew what happened, and they didn't really care they knew what happened for their own purposes, whereas we fetishize the origins in contemporary scholarship. Yet, as you pointed out, in both cases, nobody talked about how unusual or strange or ambiguous these monuments were until the 19th century, which means that, you know, and yet even though those monuments evoked that origins period, right? There's a reason, you know, one person, you know, Khudabandeh puts himself in as the possible 12th Imam. He's not enough in his own time. He has to go back to that original time. There's a reason it's a New Jerusalem, right? It's the first imperial monument in the Islamic world is in Jerusalem, not Mecca. Mecca was pre-Islamic. So it was the Dome of the Rock, the dome, right? That's the first, and it's not a mosque, it's a shrine. So they're evoking the early period as a way of projecting a particular imperial project or whatever, or pious vision. So they cared about origins, not the way we do. They cared about them in terms of how that origin created their presence. So it was that kind of, you know, both times existing at the same time, right? So I wonder if what you're really doing is telling us, using this material and this literature, not so much to tell us about them, because they didn't have an issue with understanding all of these complexities at once. We do. So you're really telling us about the field of Islamic historiography in the West, right? And I think about what you said about kind of the Sunni. I mean, Madelung wrote a screed about the hegemony of the Sunni narrative of the origins of Islam, you know, 30 years ago. So what am I missing about how the temporality argument enlarges what we already know?
Okay, so I think the question of our perspective on this material and the material itself, they're not separable.
Sorry.
Right? There's no way to stand outside of our own self.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So my sense is that by problematizing the way we approach this,
Yeah.
by deconstructing, we are actually bringing completely different lenses to bear on the original material itself. So what we claim about what happened then is actually transformed because our perspective on it is actually transformed.
But the lens you are bringing is the lens from then. It's not.
The way.
Well, okay.
The lens is from having read tremendous amounts of history of philosophy in the modern West. These things are done with the terms I'm using. These are coming from modern West.
I understand.
Right?
Okay.
But
But that raises a problem.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
if I may.
Yeah.
So there's on the one hand a deconstruction of the historical experience. On the other hand, there is an assumption that there's a universality of conceptual terms that can be used from. Right. So.
But the universality is that in order to construct the argument, one has to. But I'm saying I'm using these terms. They are not universal. It's because I have to use them. This is my perspective.
I see.
Because they're part of our
Ikrah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it really is just a part of our language.
And so we have to recognize them for what they are.
That I agree with completely.
Yeah, and that infusion into the humanities discourse was actually very powerful.
But that's a triple vigilance now. I mean, it's really.
Yeah.
One of the things where Nancy, to go along a little bit with this, that where I think majorities has to be here, but what I do find very instructive is looking and reading very carefully the introductions to chronicles and other narratives, pre-modern, where there is direct discourse on what time is, right?
Sure.
So that actually has the potential for directly addressing the questions within modern philosophy, where there is a way in which that can reference it, but without privileging one or the other.
That's a very helpful.
And in order to not privilege, you have to look at what the conception of time that we already have is.
Right.
I just got it.
Yeah, that's a very helpful. That's what I was
Can I
going to
give
say.
you concrete examples? Or you?
I'm just
Over
gonna say,
dinner.
I'm amazed about how systematically you thought this through, and I'm wondering, the missing piece for me now is this information that, or these texts that you're reading. I mean, looking at the stuff that you wrote, they're not like the standard text that every person has always read. I mean, this is a lot of difficult new material, and you didn't say anything about your methodology or the way. Maybe we can do it during the roundtable, but I
Yeah,
think
that's
we
a
need
good idea.
to It's really difficult sources.
And how you picked them and
Yeah.
why.
You mean the descriptions of the
The
buildings?
cases.
The material that you're using in order to construct your argument are not the well-trodden path of.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can
So,
I give, oh, no.
Please, I'm done.
Often. And two concrete thoughts. I'm actually trying to apply to give examples to see if I understood. Kind of doing the same thing, but Nancy be giving. One is that you have cognitive issue here of, it's compulsion of how we think in languages, and I'm thinking of this one fruit that I saw in Malaysia actually that was half apple, half pear. But we all know we have apples, we know apples, and then there are pears. But then all of a sudden you encounter this thing that is kind of both, and your categories are destabilized. But you need them. You need the categories. And so whether it's Islam, etc., Mongolian, Iran, right? But you know that there are these creatures that are apples and pears, right? So that's what I want to see. That's going on. But the other thing is this incorporation of time that's really by Muslims, right? And that's why I gave the example. So when a Muslim parent names their child, their son, Harun, Aaron, or Musa, or Yusuf, Joseph, these other, again, prophets attributed to prophets of ancient Israel, right, in the biblical tradition, but they're kind of co-opted or put in an Islamic tradition, like, oh, those were Muslims. Do you see what I'm saying? Isn't that the same thing going on? Is that a good example as well of, because there's Islam is historicized, very emphasis on final prophet, final book, but then there's this, they were Muslim, these great men of the past who are actually really pivotal in these other religions that are criticized by Islam, or actually they were Muslims too. Is that a good example?
Yeah, absolutely. But see, I think so that's a very good example of how these prehistories are a part of Islamic history. And you also have Muslim societies, people go out of their way to never use a biblical name or even an Arabic name. We're also
Well, and it's unclear Quranically what it means to have said that these prophets were Muslim. That the very understanding that it evokes a particular kind of biblical prophet is an understanding that came about and from an age way after the Quran,
Right.
So it's layer upon layer.
Exactly,
of
and it has its own history in each
Yeah.
particular case.
Thank you so much.
It's-
Yeah.